first of all, well, very much welcome from me, now based in Berlin. I'm Xiang Biao, and I have worked in Oxford for nearly 20 years, and now I'm just moved to Germany. So this is the fourth Oxford-China conversation, and the question is, what does it mean to be Chinese outside of China today? So we have a large audience today, and as I can tell already, not only that you are different parts of the world, and many of you, at least by judging your names, actually are not Chinese in origin. So I think that is important to emphasize. This question, what does it mean to be Chinese outside of China today, is not a simple question of self-identity. It's not a question that the Chinese overseas asking about themselves, about their own identity. Actually, it is a question often is more interesting to people who are not Chinese. So therefore, it is a global question. It's a question of global significance. And I must acknowledge that I did not propose this question. And this is a wonderful idea from my colleagues in Oxford, particularly Matthew Ira. And the idea is also endorsed by Chigusa, and who is organizing all this behind the scene, as well as Todd Hall, the director of China Center. And the question, therefore, is globally relevant, but at the same time, the question is quite China specific. Just think, wouldn't it sound slightly strange to ask, what does it mean to be American outside of the US today? What does it mean to be an Indian outside of India today? Of course, we can ask the question. Linguistically, it makes sense, but somehow it does not really resonate. And also, it is important to pay attention to the last word of the question today, because we probably would not ask this question 20 years ago. In my mind, it was around 2008 or so. This question somehow became askable. It makes sense to ask this question. So therefore, the elephant in the room, I suppose, behind this question is not only about ethnicity, about identity, about the culture, about the Chineseness, but is very much about China itself and the relation between China and the world, as well as a very complex relation between geopolitical change on one hand and the change in identity, culture, and the communication, etc. And this is why I think it makes this question so rich, but also very difficult to address, but a fascinating question. So I guess I was asked to chair this panel, mainly because I worked on Chinese migration, but I probably can't really unpack this question in a satisfactory manner. But I'm very pleased that I have three experts today join me who will entangle this question and shed great light on this issue. So you have read their bio notes in our announcements, so therefore I will not repeat their background anymore, but just except emphasizing that they are experts on Chinese culture and the Chinese migration in different parts of the world. Gregory Lee, a professor from St. Andrews, I think expert of Chinese literature and culture, is very familiar with Chinese communities in the UK and continental Europe, and importantly, Hong Kong. I think he lived in Hong Kong for many years. And then Simeng Wang, she is a medical anthropologist who works on the mental health of Chinese, particularly younger Chinese migrants in France. And we have my old friend, Gracia Liu, professor in Waseda University in Tokyo, who has worked on Chinese migrants of different types to Japan, as well as the Chinese community in the US, one particular type of Chinese community, those the very wealthy one. I think she had a good time in doing that research. So I will now want to turn to Professor Lee straight away to address this question. Just okay, now Gregory, what is your take on this question?
Thanks very much. Well, I'm actually going to read my notes to make sure I'm in the time allotted to me. So I'd like first to thank the organizers and especially Chigusa for inviting me to participate today. The topic, what does it mean to be Chinese, in quotes, outside of China today, pushes us to address what we mean by Chinese, what we mean by China, and what Chineseness signifies. This is also a question of representation, how China and Chineseness have been represented both in China and outside of China, both in the popular imaginary and in academic discourse. For now, let's simply recall that the proper noun China is a 16th century European invention and that its Chinese language equivalent, Zhongguo, didn't become current until the second half of the 19th century. And I discuss all that at length in my recent book. I shan't dwell on it here. Our question also implies a discussion of the Chinese diaspora and on the nature of that diaspora. I think we might address that more in depth during our discussion. I'll just say for now that I see the Chinese diaspora signifying, above all, a reality of lived experience of ordinary people, of women, of men who've settled around the world, who've lived through the real problems of immigration, racism, and economic hardship, and whose history has, until recently, gone largely untold. But let me make a few brief remarks about the sense, the meaning of Chineseness in modern times, since we're supposed to be talking about today. For China's authorities, Chineseness may arise from several conditions. One, living within the confines of the borders of China from Tibet to Hong Kong, regardless of ethnic origins, or at least that was the case until the advent of President Xi Jinping's administration and a policy that looks more and more like national homogenization. Two, and this is seemingly contradictory, having Chinese, quotes, blood, in other words, being of Han Chinese ancestry, wherever you live in the world, which obviously begs the question of the definition of Han. It also leaves aside the question of other China-defined ethnicities in the diaspora, such as the Hakka people. And three, there is being simply Chinese because the Chinese authorities say you are, as in when they refuse to recognize naturalization to other nationalities and subject you to Chinese law. So that's the view from Beijing, if you like. So let me address our question once again. What does it mean to be Chinese outside of China today? And this question's not new, but the answers periodically and necessarily need to shift. So let's come straight to today's Britain, since that's where we are, I am. Tens of thousands, more likely hundreds of thousands of people will be taking advantage of the UK government's BNO, that's the British National Overseas Passport Holders Visa Scheme. And they will move to the UK from Hong Kong. Their attachment to a form of Chinese culture is obvious, but they are also Hong Kongers, just as the hundreds of thousands who have emigrated to Canada over the 40 years since Mrs. Thatcher signed away Hong Kong to PRC sovereignty. There's also a difference between current immigration from Hong Kong and that which took place in the 1960s and 1970s. Many of those immigrants had direct connections to mainland China. For them, Hong Kong had been just a halfway house, preferably to the USA, but by default to the UK. Not so the current migrants for whom Hong Kong was very much home. So I think today we can legitimately talk of a Hong Kong diaspora as distinct from a Chinese diaspora. The makeup of the UK population that claims Chinese heritage has always varied. The provincial origins of the various communities have changed from decade to decade, but the preponderant mainland Chinese migration that we've seen here since the 1990s, mainly student-led, will now be supplemented by a significant migration from Hong Kong. In a sense, then, that will reconnect communities with their formerly dominant Cantonese-speaking origins. However, the social base of those now emigrating and their sense of belonging will probably be quite distinct. So for now, we're stuck with the proper noun China and the adjective Chinese to describe people, country, ethnicity, language, and these are terms that are woefully inadequate to describe the complexity behind them, but extremely useful to those who would mask reality. As to the question of identity, in the USA, what we now call Chinese Americans fought long and hard to shake off terms like ABC, American-born Chinese, to arrive at Chinese American without the hyphen, to be first and foremost American, the noun, the person, the citizen, where Chinese simply denotes an origin, like Polish American, Italian American. In the UK, however, we settled for British Chinese, where origin and appearance predominate. Recently, in an attempt to be inclusive and to embrace those who look Chinese to white eyes, but are not, and also so as to foster a greater inclusiveness, younger generations have preferred the term British East Asian. But the problem remains the same, and they're stuck with categories not of their own making. Of course, to some of us, for historical and political reasons, the category East Asian is also somewhat inappropriate. None of these categories, in any case, are leak-proof. I mentioned just now Chinese American, but that too can be seen as homogenizing. Many of those with Taiwan origins, for example, prefer to be known as Taiwanese American. Sadly, whether you identify as Chinese American or Taiwanese American or even Korean American, most white Americans will see you as simply Chinese. And if they subscribe to Trump's Chinese virus conspiracy theory, will see you also as a legitimate target for anti-Chinese aggression. Thus, one's apparent Chineseness can be a question of plain survival. For first, second, third generation Chinese in Europe and elsewhere, the issue is crucial today, once again, and the issue is one of racism. So would it be possible to try to rethink, to reimagine Chineseness for those outside China? In spatial and societal terms, we could start by recognizing the multiplicity and the plurality of Chinese identities. Most importantly, the reality of lived experience, societal and cultural mixity should be admitted and respected, as should the right of the individual to identify themselves as they wish and not as the beholder imposes. So I don't think I've answered the question. What I've tried to do is to complicate it, and I hope that that can be addressed in the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gregory. Certainly you have complicated the question very productively, and you provide such a brilliant overview of the cultural politics and the history about the category, the very generic, somehow emotive, but of course we know it's empirically very inaccurate category of Chinese and Chineseness. So now we wonder how people who actually live with such a category, who live under such a category, feel and experience about that. I know that Simeng has worked on mental health, and which is a very sensitive approach to the diaspora experiences. Simeng, can you tell us about your analysis on this question?
Thank you, Biao. Thank you, Gregory, for your speech. So greeting to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to join this panel. Your series, Oxford-China Conversation, deals with very exciting issues, and you do a great job. And I'd like to begin with sharing with you ethnographic case studies of a Chinese family living in Paris that I have followed between 2012 and 2015. Daniel is born in France from two Chinese parents of Zhejiang province, immigrated in France in the 80s after the opening of China. His parents succeeded in running a catering restaurant after over 10 years of working as employees, at first as undocumented migrants, before obtaining a legal status. And Daniel was studying for a master's degree in international marketing at Paris University. And during an interview, Daniel blamed his parents for cutting off the channels of transmission of Chinese language and cultures, and expressed his incomprehension about why his parents left China. While for young people of his generation, China is one of the professional dream destinations. Whereas during another interview that I carried out with Daniel's parents, they consider their migration as one of the only ways out of poverty in the context of China at that time. And their migration has indeed been marked by sacrifice, suffering, and sorrow. Meanwhile, they think their migration story is too ordinary to be told to Daniel and not even worth telling. So between the generation of Daniel's parents and his, 30 years have passed. And during these decades, the rise of China placed the country in the center of international trade, but also of cultural export. So these social, historical, and economical geopolitical transformations on macro social scale have impacts on the individual level among the overseas Chinese. So as illustrated by the Daniel's family, these changes can lead to important discrepancies in the image and comprehension of China between generations of Chinese outside of China. So young people do not understand why their parents wanted to leave their country of origin in miserable, even undocumented travel conditions, living with the difficulties and precariousness in host country for years, to finally reach a social position of small middle class with economic resources, certainly, but without legitimate cultural capital, according to the dominant norms of French society. So while Daniel's French peers learn Chinese and aspire to some professional opportunities in China in the 2000s, Daniel's feel perplexed with his origin and he's in full search of his identity. In France, however, in his own country, Daniel is often racialized as Chinese by his physical appearance. And at the same time, he does not speak Chinese language very well and does not know much about this vast country. Feeling trapped in this ethno-racial level by the outside world, which does not suit him, and at the same time cut off from the intergenerational transmissions of Chinese cultures in his family, Daniel is in pain. So by this example, I would like to emphasize how the most intimate, emotional, and sentimental individual lives of overseas Chinese are connected to, but also traversed by contemporary Chinese story and the macro social context of emigration and immigration. Daniel's case reveals a social trajectory, among others, of the descendants of Chinese migrants in France, and the strong heterogeneity within the Chinese population living in the same country is undeniable. According to the social relations of migratory generation, gender, class, position, region of origin, and so on. There are multi ways to be Chinese outside of China. This is what I observe in France through various empirical fields. And today, in the context of the global COVID pandemic, across countries and also beyond within group differences among Chinese living in the same country, one of the common challenges for all overseas Chinese would be the stigmatization of Chinese population that is currently occurring. As the COVID pandemic was first detected around Wuhan city before spreading around the world, discrimination and social exclusion against the Chinese people became an increasingly global phenomenon. And people perceived to be Chinese and more broadly Asian have been associated with COVID and are consequently suffering from discrimination, unfair treatment, and racism, and including in some cases physical assault. So I will stop here for the moment. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Simeng. I think Daniel's very moving experiences, at least for me, really troubles our stereotype that overseas Chinese families are always very keen to pass down on their heritage and culture and identity. Actually, many young people, precisely as you described so nicely, they're trapped in a void, right? And they don't know why the parents did that and what they should do now. And I guess this intergenerational improvement in living standards and material life, probably it's common among many migrant populations. But what appears to be quite curious is their parents' silence. Their parents' silence of their migratory past. Because we think in many other communities, people were very keen, I mean, like especially the Jew diaspora, will write down all their pains to be some material to be memorized and even celebrated. But there's many working class Chinese migrants, they try to forget about their past and they kept silence, therefore leave their children in such a void. I mean, that's the part of this act of forgetting. I think it's interesting, not only as a cultural phenomenon. I suppose that is somehow metaphorically also related to what China as a nation has gone through over the last 40 or 50 years, right? The past pain and the suffering, how do you accommodate it? Because we somehow, everyone is rushing towards a brighter future, but the brighter future is built on something less bright of yesterday. And how shall we bring that back in? So now, Gracia, and we now probably move to another very important Asian country, Japan. Yeah, what's the situation of the Chinese community there?
Okay, thank you, Biao. And let me share some PowerPoint slides. I just, in order to organize my own thoughts, I just prepared several slides. All right. I think I'm afraid the question that I'm not able to answer is, what does it mean to be Chinese outside of China today? Because obviously I omitted in my title because I'm not able to answer it. So I feel that in order to understand the Chineseness outside China, you also have to understand the receiving context, receiving nation as a place that overseas Chinese live, because Chineseness does not mean the same thing for people outside China in different regions and countries. And, Chineseness takes on the significance in different contexts, I'm sorry. So the ethno-nationalist Japan being a receiving context of a Chinese here where I live, really, plays a role in how Chinese people in Japan constructs their discourses and identity around Chineseness. So first of all, unlike Chinese in the Western countries, it's not racially and ethnically distinct from Japanese. So I think there's this there's this lack of racial difference actually is also important. And also Japan has this ethno-national discourse of what Japaneseness means, refers to. So I think with this sort of essentialized national identity in Japan, I think it also plays a role in essentializing Chineseness in Japan as well. And also the Japan-China's historical relationship, the war also plays a role in how Chinese people think of themselves in Japan. So I just want to highlight the context as one important, sorry. So what I see actually what Chineseness means, I think I'm a little bit kind of different, having different take here. I try to kind of interpret how Chinese is used and also means in people's discourses, how they narrate the Chineseness. So first of all, I think Chineseness is an essentialist national identity. So when overseas Chinese talk about Chinese, it's, and the Chinese identity is always about blood, roots, primordial and unchangeable kind of national identity, such as all the quotes in Chinese that I give out here, because I interviewed hundreds of Chinese people in Japan about their identity and belonging. They talk about I'm born Chinese person and die a Chinese, ghost. And also, my roots are in China and my blood is Chinese. All that sort of discourses are very, very much kind of tied to the ethnic essentialist national identity. But if you're not Han Chinese, for a lot of ethnic minorities in Japan, Chineseness becomes a choice. So that, for example, for people from ethnic Koreans or ethnic Uyghurs, actually, right now, they tend not to talk about Chinese as their identity, for example. Rather, they feel that the kind of framework of China is off, then they can talk about their ethnic identity. So I can also see that. But what I see that actually is very interesting is the Chineseness becomes a habitus when people refers to Chineseness. So first of all, Chineseness becomes a kind of disposition. Have the stereotypes of how Chinese people are like, or how Japanese people are like at work, or in terms of relationship, how Chinese people can always stick together, warm, or be easier to talk to and easier to make friends with, while Japanese people are cold, etc. So all those discourses, I will code them as kind of a habitus talk. And because there isn't this uniform Chinese habitus all over China. So it's always inconsistent when people talk about what Chineseness means, or what Chinese does, or what Chinese attitudes should be. So and the narratives are oftentimes inconsistent. So the Chineseness here also means habitus. It's a kind of a cultural, internalized, embodied kind of cultural structure. Then because Chinese means habitus and this essentialist identity at the same time, what I notice is this difficulty in articulating their identity among the overseas Chinese, and the identity confusion oftentimes creates. For example, I have this quote here. Is this person, I would just translate into English. This person says, well, sometimes when I talk to Chinese, and then I feel like can't really, we can't, it's just like it do not fit, can do not feel comfortable, and their ways of thinking and very different from me, and making me confused. I no longer sure whether I'm Chinese or I'm Japanese. So I think when people talk about Chinese, and because of the identity, national identity and habitus are mixed together, it creates kind of identity confusion. All right, I think I'll just stop here, and I don't know if this kind of answers the question, but I hope, yeah.
No, certainly they shed a very important light, Gracia. Thanks a lot. One, actually, you said you couldn't address the question today. Of course, you were talking about today, the contemporary situation in which both China and Japan are changing very fast. I mean, it just came to my mind that a similar question could have been asked. What does that mean to be something outside of your home country? Would it be the early 20th century for Japanese, especially probably after 1905, the Japan-Russian War. And then, of course, during the Second World War in North America, probably does mean a lot. What does it mean to be Japanese outside of Japan? And, lots of the writers like Natsume Kinosaki, who was in London and also made a big deal about all this Japaneseness and etc. So I think I just wonder whether or not some historical comparison can be made. So therefore, as a way to understand the cultural logic of the geopolitical change that we are going through today, right? I'm still kind of interested in why this question itself become relevant. But then the micro cultural logic that you have reviewed, I think it is very interesting about the identity is essentialized, but actually the way they practice it is a matter of habitus, and it's very much specific to the context. So do you have any questions to each other among ourselves? Yeah, Gregory.
Comment picking up on what you were saying to after Wang Simeng's intervention. I presume the French, the Chinese, they're actually from, you said from Zhejiang, they're from Wenzhou, are they? Yeah, of course. So, I mean, that historically is also very interesting because there were two moments of immigration, one before 1949 and then this second one in the 1980s. So there were sort of uncles and aunts and sometimes grandparents already there. And so that's why you have that very particular kind of Chinese community with their own sort of Chinese dialect as well. It's very interesting, in fact. And the differences also, I think, are because, the way the United Kingdom interacted with China over the last century and a half was slightly different to France, and because France was there as one of the 8 nations and invading the Summer Palace and what have you. But the UK's relationship was always hard-nosed, economic, political, exploitative, where France's was slightly more cultural and more superficial, or at least that's the way it's seen from the Chinese side very often. But it means that also in France that there is this incapacity to see that there's any kind of deep relationship with China that goes beyond the kind of the exotic or the orientalizing. So I mean, that exists in the UK, of course, but there is a sort of other side to it where we can't escape from our reality, and Hong Kong and the current situation is part of that reality. But I wanted just to comment into your comment where you said that the parents were silent, and then the second generation was sort of left in with a lot of questions. But there are moments in the history of 20th century they didn't want to ask questions. So first of all, the immigrants didn't want to talk about this horrible experience that they'd had coming away. The second generation were just trying not to be Chinese, and that was especially the case in the United Kingdom, where most of the second generation were actually half Chinese and half English or half Irish. So I think that makes a big difference, in fact. So people were trying to pass, in fact, rather than be interested. And then maybe later in life started to get interested in their Chinese origins. But I think you have to take into account from the 1930s to the 1970s, Britain's relationship with China, and maybe even before the 1930s, was marked by yellow peril. And then the fear of Red China. So it was only in the 1970s, late 1970s, as China started opening up, people started appreciating Hong Kong film, Bruce Lee, for instance, that it suddenly started to be acceptable to take on your Chinese identity and to start to be proud of it. And I think now, unfortunately, because of COVID, we've moved into another moment, or moved back actually into a moment where people are scared of being Chinese, but there's not much they can actually do about it. So I'm sorry I've spoken for too long, but I just wanted to say that it really is to do with the historical and the local context, as the other two speakers have actually made very clear.
Simeng, do you want? Yeah.
Yeah, just to thank you for your comments, Biao and Gregory. I think it's very interesting to compare, of course, the UK case and French case, because the national context of installation are not the same. So, of course, the life stories they are not the same. So just to be complete, I think because the Daniel's parents they immigrated in France after the opening of China. So many Chinese working class newcomers immigrated at that time in France. They decided to keep silence about their migration. Why? Because for many of them, they traveled illegally. And during the trip, some of them have also experienced violence and trauma. So especially for women, about some physical assault and even rapes. So that's why most of these parents that I interviewees, they are not comfortable with their own migration stories, and they are ashamed somehow of themselves. That's why they decided to keep silence about this past also.
Yeah, I wonder, Gracia, the Gregory and the Simeng, I think, brought in a very interesting analytical and historical thread, which is about, the dialectical relation between silence and expressiveness, right? What is a better strategy? You want to bury yourself among the masses and be quiet, keep your head low, or you want to speak out and celebrate multiculturalism and assert your identity? Of course, as you mentioned, in Japan, it's very different because just, physiology, there's appearances, it does not mark them out. But do you observe something similar? The kind of people choose between the silence strategy and the expressive strategy, given the relation between Japan and China is really up and down all the time.
Right. I think this sort of is a very interesting kind of description of this kind of social, change of how Chinese identify or express themselves in different national contexts. In Japan, certainly you see this silent kind of phase, and especially because the migration into I'm talking about post-war migration. The post-war migration did not really start into Japan, did not start until basically 1980s. So all the Chinese are very new here, and they have very little to do with the old generation Chinese who came during and before the war. So there are very different kind of groups of people. But among the newcomer Chinese, those who came in 1980s and 1990s, after they acquired the Japanese habitus, the cultural practices, they practice passing, a lot of them. But this has less to do with geopolitical and historical antagonism than it's a sense of, China is still economically backward, developing country and being looked down upon. And also, I think even now among the Chinese in Japan, there's this general respect for Japanese people's, rule-abiding behavior and a public civility. And they always, and for a lot of Chinese who have lived in Japan for some time, they observe that behavioral patterns are very different. And in fact, a lot of Chinese are very assimilatory and willing to be assimilated culturally into a Japanese society, because they see that as somehow a more civilized behavioral pattern. But at the same time, I think they are willing to be more outspoken, and both in terms of especially the younger generation, because this social economic context of China has changed. And then you mentioned 2008. It was a very interesting because that was the year a lot of Chinese organized this this torch protection kind of relay in Nagano. And actually that was it was in Nagano. They have this kind of torch relay. I think they were organizing, and so that moment, the Peking Olympic kind of was a moment that they felt that they could be proud of being Chinese. But still, in a daily practice, I think I observed that it's very culturally try to be Japanese. So I think maybe that's the different context, because in Japan, Chinese can pass, but in the UK and France, you can't in most circumstances. So I think that might be the difference.
That's very interesting, because the fact that you look very different for Chinese in so-called Western countries may in a way force you to speak up, because you can't pass anyway, right? So therefore it creates a particular racial politics and identity politics. And most academic literature, of course, is based on this paradigm. So now, if you look at the communities in Asia, and we have not touched on a very important part of the world, the Southeast Asia, it's all kind of multi-ethnic mingling together. And the way they negotiate identities and deal with the racial relations, it probably is very different from what we see, as a kind of US paradigm. In individual identity, you have to be assertive, stand up, and etc. We're not seeing which one is more successful, more desirable. But I think for academic paradigm, I'm just sometimes wondering whether or not we have put too much emphasis on this kind of individual identity assertion. Like Gracia said, sometimes it is more about the manners, right? The way you conduct, and that kind of things can be also very important as well in establishing a sense about the self, about the relation between you and the larger society. So now, Gregory.
I noticed there are a couple of very interesting questions coming in on the Q&A.
Yeah.
I don't want to jump the gun, but I noticed that talking about emigration and diasporic communities in other parts of the world, such as South America. We do tend to forget that. And we do tend to forget that migration took place because the Chinese emigration to the United States was made illegal from the 1980s to the 1940s. So Chinese couldn't actually acquire Chinese American citizenship, and were very much discouraged from even trying to get there. And so that resulted in people going to Australia and going to South Africa and going to South America, where the reception wasn't much better. And it's quite interesting, just 3 days ago, the president of Mexico issued an official apology for the massacre of thousands of Chinese, and mainly shopkeepers. There was a lot of envy in the early part of the 20th century, around 1911. So that apology has finally come, but it also brings out that history once again. But it's interesting because in recent years that there has been even before COVID, quite a nasty anti-Chinese racism that's flared up again in Mexico. And then was asking this question about miscegenation and hybrid communities. I think we have partly addressed that. And very often that was to do with the circumstances of migration in the past. So in the first part of the 20th century, Chinese were not immigrants; they saw themselves as sojourners, didn't they, in the United States? So they were coming as the men came as sort of bachelors with an intention of going home, but then didn't. The same thing in the United Kingdom, or former seamen who were left in ports, and then they would actually marry local women because there were no Chinese women. And so that gave rise to Chinatowns that were very much hybrid. So the Chinatowns in England, for instance, before the 1960s, bear very little resemblance to the Chinatowns after the 1960s, when there was a lot of immigration from Hong Kong of families, of men, women, and children already. So you get a very different kind of take on what Chinatown means to different generations.
Thank you very much, Gregory. So you are actually ahead of us and also did a wonderful job of chairing already. It is a very multi-layered history, obviously, Chinese overseas. Now we will move on to